Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going deep into the life and work of Karl Marx,
Oh, yeah.
someone you've definitely heard of.
Of course.
But get ready for some surprises,
Okay.
because we're going way beyond just the typical sound bites you always hear.
Right.
Our main guide for this deep dive is the biography, Karl Marx,
Yeah.
a biography by David McClellan.
Great book.
And are you ready to uncover the real person behind that iconic beard
Absolutely.
and explore some of the contradictions about Marx that are often misunderstood?
I think you'll be surprised by how much more there is to Marx than just revolutionary slogans.
Okay.
Even his origins challenge a lot of assumptions people make about him.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
So first up is his Jewish heritage.
Right.
It's pretty ironic that the man who famously critiqued religion came from a long line of rabbis.
It really is. And while his father converted to Protestantism, it seems like it was more for pragmatic reasons than any deep conviction.
All right.
So you have this fascinating mix of religious background and, let's say, a less than enthusiastic embrace of it from his father.
Talk about clashing ideals.
Yeah.
Marx's dad was a staunch rationalist and apparently wasn't too thrilled about his son's early romantic phase.
Really?
I mean, picture young Marx, the future revolutionary, writing poems about
Wow.
gnomes, sirens, songs to stars, and bold knights.
It's quite a contrast, isn't it? You can almost hear his father scolding him, urging him towards a more practical path.
Right.
There's actually a quote from a letter where his father chides him for degeneration in a learned dressing gown with uncombed hair.
Wow.
He really wanted his son to focus on something more well-grounded.
And speaking of grounded, this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Remember that famous quote from Marx? The tradition of all the dead generations weighs like a mountain on the mind of the living.
Yes.
That takes on a whole new meaning when you consider his family's deep religious history. It makes you wonder how those dead generations of rabbis might have influenced his thinking, even if he ultimately rejected their beliefs.
Absolutely. It's like he couldn't escape the weight of history, both personal and societal.
Yeah,
And we can't forget Jenny von Westphalen, Marx's wife.
of course.
She was an incredible intellectual force, constantly challenging and refining his ideas.
Their letters are amazing. It's like a constant intellectual sparring match.
I know.
She was far more than just a supportive spouse.
Right.
She really pushed him to think critically and develop his ideas further.
For example, there's this one letter where Jenny pushes back on Marx's intense focus on their love.
Okay.
She talks about not being able to help being mindful of external things of life and reality. It's almost as if she sensed that his thinking needed to move beyond the purely idealistic and engage with the material world.
It's like she's nudging him toward the path that would define his life's work. And this leads us perfectly into the evolution of Marx's thought. He went through a major shift, moving from romantic idealism to what he called seeking the idea in the real itself.
This shift was absolutely crucial for his development.
Yeah.
It's where he started to move away from abstract philosophy and really delve into the messy realities of economics and the struggles of everyday people.
And the turning point seems to have been his job as editor of the Rheinische Zeitung.
Interesting.
He suddenly had to grapple with what he called material interests. You know, things like wood theft and
Yeah.
the struggles of wine growers.
Exactly. It might seem trivial at first, but these issues forced Marx to confront the concrete problems people were facing.
Right.
For example, you might think wood theft is just a small crime, but for Marx it represented how even seemingly minor economic realities could lead to conflict and expose the power imbalances within society.
Yeah.
It's the beginning of his lifelong focus on those who were, in his words, oppressed creatures.
So right from the start, we see this tension between his religious upbringing and the rationalist, even somewhat anti-religious views his father espoused. This seems to have foreshadowed the intellectual struggles Marx would grapple with throughout his life.
Definitely.
But tell me more about this focus on oppressed creatures.
Well, it's here that we start to see the seeds of his critique of religion taking root. Now, we've all heard that famous line, religion is the opium of the people,
Right.
but it's often taken out of context.
You're right. People often assume he was just denouncing religion outright.
Exactly. But it's crucial to understand that Marx wasn't saying religion was the cause of social ills,
Right.
but rather a symptom. He believed religion was a way for people to cope with their suffering, but one that ultimately kept them from challenging the real root of their problems.
So he's not necessarily anti-religion, but anti the role it plays in a system that he saw as inherently broken.
Right.
But wouldn't some argue that religion itself can be a powerful tool for social control, actively perpetuating inequality?
That's a great question, and I think it's one that Marx would have engaged with directly. He might argue that even if religion provides comfort or a sense of community, it often distracts people from fighting for real change in the material world.
Okay.
Instead of addressing issues like poverty or exploitation head-on, people might turn to religion for solace, which could ultimately benefit those in power.
That's a really interesting perspective. So instead of placing the blame solely on religion, he saw it as part of a larger system that needed to be fundamentally transformed.
Precisely. And to understand how he envisioned fixing that broken system, we need to look at his fascination with the French Revolution.
Okay.
He saw it as a model for social change, highlighting the power of collective action to overthrow an unjust order.
This is where his ideas about class struggle and the role of the proletariat come in.
Absolutely. But before we dive into that, let's take a moment to understand the philosophical framework that shaped Marx's thinking.
Right.
He was heavily influenced by a philosopher named Hegel. Now, Hegel had some pretty complex ideas, but one of his key concepts was the idea of the dialectic.
Okay. I've definitely heard of the dialectic.
Yeah.
But to be honest, I'm a little fuzzy on the details.
Well, in simple terms, the dialectic describes a process of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis.
Okay.
You have an initial idea, a thesis, which then encounters an opposing idea, the antithesis. The clash between these two ideas ultimately leads to a new, more developed idea, the synthesis.
So it's like a constant process of ideas evolving and transforming through conflict.
Exactly. And this is where things get really fascinating.
So,
Marx took Hegel's dialectic and applied it to history and society. This is where we get his theory of historical materialism.
okay, I have a feeling this is going to be important.
Yes.
Tell me more.
Well, historical materialism argues that history is driven by material conditions, primarily economic factors.
Yeah.
Think of it this way. The way goods are produced and distributed in a society shapes its social structures, its political systems, its culture, even its ideas.
So he's saying that economics is the foundation of everything else? That's a pretty bold claim.
It is. But it's crucial for understanding Marx's entire worldview. And it's this focus on material conditions that led him to champion the proletariat, the working class, as the driving force of historical change.
Okay, this is where we need to dive deeper. Tell me, why did he believe so strongly in the power of the proletariat?
Well, he saw the working class as the group most directly exploited by the capitalist system. Remember those oppressed creatures we talked about earlier? He believed they were the ones who experienced the contradictions of capitalism most acutely.
So it wasn't just a sentimental attachment to the working class. It was a strategic analysis of their position within the economic system.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting. Was Marx's faith in the proletariat based solely on this empirical observation of their situation, or was it also shaped by his Hegelian philosophical framework? It's a question worth pondering.
I like where this is going. But before we get into that, I think we need to take a break and come back fresh to tackle this question of the proletariat and their role in Marx's vision of revolution.
I'm ready when you are. There's a lot more to uncover about Marx's ideas and how they continue to resonate today.
Sounds good. So we were just talking about Marx's fascination with the proletariat and their potential role in revolution.
Right.
You mentioned this question of whether his belief in their power came from observation or from his Hegelian philosophy.
Yes, it's a fascinating question. On the one hand, he clearly witnessed the struggles of the working class firsthand. Remember his time at the Rheinische Zeitung dealing with issues like wood theft and the plight of wine growers?
Right.
Those experiences gave him a direct understanding of the hardships faced by everyday people.
So that's the empirical side of things.
Right.
But what about the Hegelian influence?
Well, Hegel believed that history unfolded through this process of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis.
Oh.
Marx took this idea and applied it to class struggle. He saw the proletariat, the working class, as the antithesis to the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class.
So in Marx's view, the conflict between these two classes would eventually lead to a new synthesis, a new kind of society.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he believed that the proletariat, by virtue of their position within the capitalist system, were the ones best equipped to bring about this new society. They were the ones who experienced the contradictions of capitalism most directly, the ones who suffered the most from its inequalities.
He had a pretty intense way of describing them, calling the proletariat the complete loss of humanity that could only recover itself through a complete redemption of humanity.
Those are powerful words. But to understand what he meant, we need to dive into one of his most important concepts: alienation.
I think this is something a lot of people can relate to, even if they haven't read a word of Marx.
Yeah.
It's that feeling of being disconnected from your work, from what you produce, even from yourself.
Exactly. It's that sense of being a cog in a machine, of not having control over your own life. And labor Marx identified 4 main types of alienation that workers experience under capitalism.
Whoa, 4 types.
Yeah.
Tell me more.
First, there's alienation from the product of their labor. Workers spend their days making things, but they don't own what they create. Those products belong to the capitalists.
That makes sense. You put in all this effort, but you don't get to enjoy the fruits of your labor.
Right. Second, there's alienation from the process of labor. Work becomes repetitive and mindless, dictated by the needs of the machines and the demands of the bosses. There's no creativity or joy in the work itself.
It's like you're just going through the motions, not really engaged in what you're doing.
Exactly. Third, there's alienation from our species being. This is a bit more abstract, but basically it means that capitalism prevents us from fulfilling our potential as human beings.
Okay, I can see how that connects to the idea of being dehumanized by work.
Right.
You're not allowed to express your creativity, your intelligence, your unique talents.
Precisely. And finally, there's alienation from other people. Capitalism pits workers against each other, competing for jobs and wages. It creates a sense of isolation and disconnection.
Wow, when you break it down like that, it's pretty bleak. But, I've actually experienced some of these forms of alienation myself. I remember working a summer job in a factory. It was mind-numbingly repetitive, and I felt totally disconnected from the final product. It was like I was just a small, replaceable part in a giant system.
It's a common experience, unfortunately. And it's exactly what Marx was trying to highlight. He believed that this alienation was inherent to the capitalist system.
So what was his solution? How did he envision overcoming this alienation?
Well, this is where his idea of communism comes in.
And let's be clear here.
Yes.
We're not talking about the communism that's been implemented in certain countries throughout history.
Right.
We're talking about Marx's original vision.
That's an important distinction. Marx was very critical of what he called crude forms of communism. He wasn't simply advocating for a redistribution of wealth.
So it's not just about everyone having equal amounts of stuff.
Not at all. It's about fundamentally changing the relationship between people and their work and between people and each other. For Marx, communism was about creating a society where people were no longer alienated from their labor, from themselves, or from each other.
Sounds pretty utopian.
It does, doesn't it? And that's been one of the main critiques of Marx's vision. Can we really create a society where alienation is completely eradicated, where everyone is truly free and fulfilled?
Those are tough questions. But I think it's important to remember that Marx wasn't just some armchair philosopher.
Right.
He was deeply concerned with the very real suffering he saw around him.
Absolutely. And that's what makes him such a compelling figure.
Yeah.
He wasn't just trying to come up with abstract theories. He wanted to change the world. He wanted to create a more just and equitable society.
And that brings us back to the question of the proletariat.
Right.
If they were the key to achieving this communist utopia, what did he envision their role to be?
Well, he believed that the proletariat would eventually develop a class consciousness, a realization of their shared interests and their power to overthrow the capitalist system.
So it's not just about individual workers being unhappy.
No.
It's about them coming together as a collective force for change.
Exactly. And Marx believed that this class consciousness would arise organically out of the contradictions of capitalism itself.
So it wouldn't be imposed from above by some revolutionary vanguard.
Right.
It would come from the workers themselves.
Precisely. And this is where we get into some of the debates and interpretations that have surrounded Marx's ideas. How exactly would this class consciousness develop? What role would revolutionary leaders play?
Right.
These are questions that Marxists have been grappling with ever since.
But one thing is clear.
Yeah.
Marx believed that the proletariat had the potential to create a better world, a world free from exploitation and alienation.
And whether or not you agree with his vision, I think it's hard to deny the power of his ideas.
Yeah.
They've had a profound impact on history, shaping social movements, political ideologies, and even our understanding of ourselves.
So even if we don't subscribe to every detail of his theories, there's still a lot we can learn from Marx,
Absolutely.
especially his insights into the nature of capitalism and its impact on our lives.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to engage with his work critically, to understand its strengths and weaknesses, and to see how it can inform our own thinking about the challenges we face today.
Well, speaking of challenges, Marx's own life was full of them.
It was.
Let's shift gears now and talk about the man behind the ideas.
Yeah.
Our sources paint a picture of someone who was brilliant, but also deeply flawed.
Yes, he was a complex and contradictory figure. On the one hand, he was a revolutionary thinker who dedicated his life to fighting for social justice.
Right.
But on the other hand, he could be arrogant, stubborn, and even cruel at times.
He was also a devoted husband and father, despite the immense hardships he faced.
He was.
His letters to Jenny and his children reveal a deep tenderness and love that contrasts sharply with the image of the fiery revolutionary.
It's this human side of Marx that I think is often overlooked. He wasn't just an abstract theorist. He was a real person who experienced joy, sorrow, love, loss, just like the rest of us.
And those experiences shaped his work just as much as his intellectual influences did. To understand Marx, we need to understand the man, as well as the ideas.
Exactly. And that's what makes him such a fascinating figure to study. He was brilliant, flawed, passionate, and ultimately very human.
So before we wrap up, let's touch on this human side a bit more.
Okay.
We know Marx faced a lot of personal difficulties throughout his life, right?
Oh, absolutely. Life in exile was anything but easy. He struggled financially, constantly worried about providing for his family.
You can really see it in his letters to Engels, right?
Yeah.
Desperate pleas for financial help, complaints about having to pawn possessions. He even refers to his constant bouts of boils as a truly proletarian disease.
It really humanizes the revolutionary figure.
Yeah.
Here he is, this towering intellect struggling with the same mundane problems as the workers he championed. And then there were the family tragedies.
They lost several children, which must have been devastating.
Mm.
And amidst all this, his relationship with Jenny shines through as a truly remarkable partnership.
They faced so much hardship together, yet their love and intellectual connections seem to have only grown stronger. We have a particularly moving letter from Jenny describing a severe emotional breakdown, and Marx's response is incredibly tender and supportive.
It's a reminder that behind every great thinker, there's a human being with all the complexities and vulnerabilities that come with being alive.
Absolutely.
And understanding the human side can give us a whole new perspective on their work.
Absolutely. It allows us to see them not just as icons or symbols, but as real people who loved, laughed, struggled, and ultimately tried to make sense of the world around them.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored Marx's life, his influences, the evolution of his thought, his key concepts, and even his struggles as a man.
We have.
But what does it all mean? What are the key takeaways for our listener?
Well, for me, one of the most important takeaways is the importance of context. We can't understand Marx's ideas without understanding the historical, social, and economic conditions that shaped them. And we can't fully appreciate his work without understanding the man behind the ideas, his passions, his flaws, his humanity.
You know, it's funny. We started this deep dive by talking about how we wanted to go beyond the typical sound bites about Marx.
Right.
And I think we've done that.
Right.
We've shown that he was much more than just a revolutionary slogan or a bearded icon.
We've seen the complexity of his thought, the depth of his analysis, and the passion that drove his work.
And we've also seen the struggles he faced, the challenges he overcame, and the deep humanity that shines through his writings and his relationships.
It's been a fascinating journey, and hopefully it's given our listener a new appreciation for Karl Marx, not just as a thinker, but as a human being.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listener with a final thought-provoking question. Given everything we've learned about Marx's life, his intellectual journey, and the challenges he faced, how should we approach his ideas today?
That's a great question, and I think it's one that each listener needs to answer for themselves. But I would encourage everyone to engage with Marx's work critically, to think about its relevance to the world we live in today, and to see how his insights can inform our own struggles for a more just and equitable society.
And for those who want to dive deeper into Marx's work, we'll include some additional resources in the show notes. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of Karl Marx. It's amazing to think about how much his ideas continue to spark debate and inspire action even today.
Definitely. And it's a testament to the power of those ideas.
Yeah.
But love him or hate him. Marx forced us to confront some fundamental questions about power inequality and the very nature of human society.
We've talked about Marx the thinker, the revolutionary, the man. But our deep dive wouldn't be complete without acknowledging the legacy of his work. I mean, his ideas have had a massive impact on history.
That's an understatement. His writings have inspired countless social movements and revolutions, from the Paris Commune to the Russian Revolution to the rise of labor unions worldwide.
It's wild to think that a philosopher, sitting in the British Museum, scribbling away in his notebooks, could have such a profound impact on the world.
It speaks to the power of ideas to change the course of history. Whether or not you agree with Marx's solutions, he undeniably put his finger on some of the most pressing issues of his time, issues that continue to resonate with us today.
One thing that struck me throughout this deep dive is the surprising relevance of Marx's ideas to our modern world. I mean, we live in an age of globalization, automation, and growing economic inequality.
It's almost eerie how some of his observations about the nature of capitalism seem even more relevant today than they were in the 19th century.
Exactly. We see this intense concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, while wages stagnate for many teens. Technology is rapidly changing the nature of work, leaving some people feeling well alienated.
It's like we're living through some of the very contradictions that Marx predicted.
So how should we approach his ideas today? I mean,
Mhm.
we've learned he was a complex figure full of contradictions. Some of his predictions haven't quite panned out the way he envisioned.
Right. It's not about taking his ideas as gospel or trying to implement some rigid blueprint for revolution. I think the real value of engaging with Marx lies in his critical analysis of capitalism, his focus on power dynamics, and his emphasis on the need for social justice.
It's about using his work as a lens through which to examine our own society, to ask tough questions and to imagine alternative possibilities.
Exactly. Whether you agree with his solutions or not, Marx's work remains a powerful tool for understanding the world around us and for inspiring us to fight for a more just and equitable future.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. Marx challenged us to think critically, to question assumptions, and to imagine a better world. And that's a legacy worth preserving regardless of your political leanings.
Couldn't agree more. Engaging with Marx's ideas, even if you disagree with them, forces you to sharpen your own thinking and to confront some of the most fundamental questions about how we organize our society.
Well said. And that wraps up our deep dive into the life and work of Karl Marx. It's been a fascinating journey. We hope you've enjoyed exploring the complex and often misunderstood world of this iconic thinker.
Thanks for joining us. And remember, the deep dive doesn't end here. We encourage you to continue exploring Marx's work and to see how his ideas might inform your own understanding of the world.
And for those who want to go even deeper, we've got some great resources in the show notes. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.